in front of him. He was where he hoped to be. He recognized it instantly, but something was missing. He looked at the horizon closely. No duck blinds. He must be in an older moment. He looked down and gazed at something he did not expect to see. The closest to the water he could see was the found outlines of words. No, names. Names he could not quite recall. The names that were closest to him he remembered the best. They got more fitted the further out they got. Liam, Cayle, Her. Further out, Freddirene. He was barely able to make out. He watched and wondered what the names were there for. What did they mean? With every passing wave, the names got thinner and harder to see. He carefully avoided stepping on the names to break one of the carefully written names. The sand was soft and warm like the parchment he used to play on when he was a kid before Lake Erie stole its sands. He looked at all the rocks and sea glass, flat, thin stones perfectly made to skip across the ground. Sea glass in the colors of red and green, not unlike the wine bottles or furnishing of his grandmother's house. He picked up the sea glass and put it in his coat pocket. His grandmother collected it all his life. Red was his grandmother's favorite color, and it was a color seen throughout a lot of his childhood. The water was cold, like the waters he used to go canoeing in as a child. He pulled away, remembering all 3 times he got hypothermia. He remembered what he had come here for. He wanted to know what lay behind that murky green water. The surface film was hiding untold secrets. His foot in the water did not sink into the sand as he expected. The sands were hard and concrete-like. He walked into the water, and the water got just over his head. He did not feel himself floating to the top. He held his breath and walked under the water, gravity still holding him down to the ground. The water resisted his movements and put an unusual pressure on his body. It was like an unwanted hug. He didn't like the feeling, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The water was free of chlorine and didn't sting his eyes, but nevertheless the water was murkier than the fogs of memories of younger days. Crunching down on something buried in the sand, it slices through his tattered shoe and buries itself in his foot. He slowly pulls it out, and the blood mixes in with the water as the current cleans the wounds. Pools of red mixed with the polluted green waters. He recognized the foreign object. The pain in his foot moves to his chest. It's a piece of a 78 RPM record. He was going to give it to the one he loved on a special occasion. She did not love him. The record was much like his love. Broken on arrival. Broken during shipment. The big ball-like mass in his stomach. Until then, he had forgotten about it. He dropped it into the ground, and the fresh water did not allow his tears. Further out into the blind travels, the records he saw a color much out of place. Pink. For his entire walk, it was the first bright thing. He walked into it, and the color dissipated and was replaced with hundreds of papers pushing down on him with what seemed to be like 100 pounds. He pushed them off, and they broke into fibers. He saw parts of floating around him. Moles. HCl. Stoichiometry. Failure. Letdown. We always thought he would go so far. He knew what these mean, but he did not want to acknowledge them. His mind had been trying to block out what these meant ever since it had happened. He wanted to vomit. A black rolling pit on the ground. It pulled his foot in, taking his shoe. His thoughts became consumed with a feeling that he had become all too familiar with now. These emotions increased in intensity like a wave. He quickly pulled his leg out and scrambled away from it. His foot with the gash in it from the record stamped across the hard sand. A shot of pain went up his spine. He wanted to starting to want to go home, but he knew he was too far out to go back now. At this point, he had lost his way, and he must have turned around at least 4 times. He was not in control. The lake was taking him by the arm here. He ran into a post. He slowly felt around. When it moved when he pushed it, pulling it up from the sand, he saw a 1996 Winnie 30-30. It was the first rifle he had held and fired. Forward in front of there was nothing. Now, 3 moose calves hung in front of him, headless and body sliced open. Something else was there, with skin grayer than that of which is under a dog's fur. He had no problem pushing past the moose. He was not comfortable with death. Death was just not the death of his family members. An old man with gray hair sat in front of him, suspended by his feet. The tide turned the corpses towards him. He recognized a tag around his ears read, "Too old." A frightening and uncomfortable thought. This was his grandfather. The walls closed in on him. They read, "Too old, too old, too old, too old, too old. Old man's going to die." He couldn't turn back, but he pushed past the corpse. The corpse's eyeless skull stared at him and emitted the cries of his grandma. Moray eels swam out of his mouth. He could only go forward. The canyon walls cast no shadow as they yelled. Suddenly as the canyons appeared, it was gone. He watched the ground grace carefully. As he went further out, the more the pits in the ground there were. He stumbled forth. He found a tattered flag with the emblem of an imaginary country on the edges. There was green slime, and it was obviously burnt. The pole it stood on was covered in algae and rust. He had trouble recalling. It was them, the friends he had in primary school. He had forgotten about them. His mind filled with the jokes of the past, and he laughed. Grade 9, all his friends had separated. He laughed, and then he laughed with melancholy, and then only now it hit him. He could actually breathe underwater. He had been so caught up in everything, he had not realized he was breathing underwater. He took a step back and tripped over a rock. His hands fell into holes that were occurring with increasing density. His mind filled with despair of losing friends he had for 6 years. Walking forward, his eyes caught glimpses of lights disappearing and reappearing. They pierced the dense blackness. He was at an unnatural depth for Lake Erie, as barely any light was getting through. A tall, thin figure. There was light around him, but he himself appeared as a silhouette. It slowly reached out and looked at him. He looked at it. The current moved as he stared at it. It was that thing that haunted his dreams since he saw it in the windows of a Catholic school in grade 9. He went around it. It was nothing. Just a shadow. He put his hands through it like it was not even there. There was larger holes all around the shadow. He was careful not to step in it. He had a feeling they would induce fear. The water pressure started to feel like it was going to crush his bones. The water resisted his every movement, but yet felt as if it was pulling him in. He hit his foot off an odd block. He felt around the ground, not being able to see the ground. It was a large brick with 2 holes in it. Strangely, he didn't remember it. He picked it up and a small tube fell out. He dropped the brick and picked up the capsule. He fumbled around with it and figured out how to remove the top. As he removed it, a burst of air left, and the contents jettisoned. The flag of Canada floated out and left with the current. A small picture of a dragon floated into his hands. You could tell it was in his distinctive style. He wondered why it was familiar. He mouthed the words. Time capsule. regret and intrigue in the back of his mind. His family had released a time capsule when he was younger. He had put a picture of a dragon in it. He regretted how quickly he did it. And when they were placing the time capsule, it was placed in a brick and put under a rock in the lake outside the family's cottage. The capsule slipped out and it was lost into the lake. He attempted to put the drawing into his coat, but when he did, the paper disintegrated and lost back into the lake. 10 clicks in an undefinable line further out. The pits got larger and larger. They were actually starting to suck in sand. They had gotten harder to see as it got darker and darker. He wondered what all these things were. He knew that the objects he found were repressed memories of some sort. He found a big tree. It was enveloped in a golden light. It pierced the darkness. His throat closed up. There was a tire on a rope hanging from the lowest branch, what seemed like miles above. His head rushed with what could only be described as melancholy. There was no pits around it. Underneath it, however, there was a pit. It was the biggest pit he had ever seen. Must have been a meter in radius. He shed a tear, but nothing came. The dark water took it away. He felt the desire just to sit on the tire one last time. In front of his grandparents' cottage, there was a tire swing that hung from a tree. It always seemed to be 1,000 years old. Hung from it was a tire that his brother and cousins would play on as kids. One day a tornado came by. It destroyed the tree and the swing, and in the middle of the tree they found a small metal tube that was there to protect it as a sapling. Looking at it here, it contrasted with the dark abyss that surrounded it, its bright green leaves, brown bark stretching to the surface. He stood in front of the pit. He held his hand out to touch the tire swing. He saw it worn and smooth. The tread algae gently grew, gently waving, just out of reach. It was like a childless dream in front of him. He wanted to go back to a simpler day, but not being able to. He reached back and realized what he was doing. He unfocused to see what was around him. The light pierced just enough to see the graveyard of ships around him. The biggest was a freighter, its hull painted red. The words Edmund Fitzgerald painted on it. Lake Erie, ship sinker, he mouthed as bubbles left his mouth. The Edmund Fitzgerald was out of place, but he knew why. When he was young, his favorite song was by Gordon Lightfoot. It was the tune that accompanied every dream of nautical adventure he ever had. For a long time, he had forgotten the song, but the tune resonated. The lyrics echoed through his head. Does anyone know where the love of God goes? When the waves turn the minutes to hours? 4 clicks. He stumbled upon a capsized canoe. It too was red. It was glossy. It had swamp plant life on it, as it just sat there in the middle of water like it was neutrally buoyant. He untipped it and 2 skeletons poured out. Their flesh was partially consumed with leeches inside the holes of their muscles. He fell to his feet and scrambled away from the sight. It was an awful looking sight. He was hand consumed by a pit as black as possible. His head filled with fear only childish mind could conjure. He screamed silently as he removed his entire arm from the pit. He remembered it, just what this was. When he was younger, he had been canoeing and found an abandoned canoe out in the middle of the swamp water. All that was in the canoe was someone's pack. It was a nice canoe, too. It would have been unreasonable to abandon it. It gave him a sinking feeling. He feared what was below the canoe lurking. He was scared that 2 corpses would rise out of the water themselves and drag him down. He was afraid that his lungs, too, would fill with that murky, leech-filled swamp water. The pressure felt as if someone was pushing against his temples. together all at once. The deeper down he went, the darker it got. He walked blindly through the depths. He wanted to go back. He needed to go back. But he had lost his way on the lake's floor. What was feeling like days ago, he stumbled upon a pile of sand. It was not salt, in fact. These grains were too large to be sand. The pile gave away underneath him. He fell down into it. Bones. The bones crushed, crumbled, and cracked as he fell into them. All of these were old memories, but bones? Bones and corpses used to haunt him. He was in a pool under a waterfall when he kept pulling claw after claw from under the murky water. The bird's talons, they were from a corpse of a dead eagle. He had no idea that it was under the water. Elora Gorge. He had found the body of what he recalled as humanoid. He could not explain what he saw. It was about 2 to 3 inches, and had what he could only describe as a human skull. It looked like a stillborn fetus. No matter how hard he tried to figure out what he had seen, he could still not tell what it was. In the walls of his house, he held fear that they would have skeletons built into them, wanting to fall out of the drywall. Like all the stories that his father had told him, like the movies he had watched, he felt their ghost watching him, waiting to suffocate him under the walls too. He pulled himself out of the quicksand-like pile of bones. They stabbed into his skin as he shattered them as he pulled himself out. He looked around as the dark spots grew in intensity, growing bigger, getting closer together. He carefully walked out of the pile of bones and walked forward 10 clicks. He came along a large green suspension bridge. It was towards the surface and got darker at the top. Beneath it was another hole, with canyons on both sides. He stared at horror as the bridge started to collapse. His gut tightened and his head started pounding. He walked on the bridge slowly, looking down at the abyssal hole beneath him. As he crossed the bridge, the concrete gave way to corpses of men in hard hats. They had a face of terror as their mouths was filled with tar and concrete. He shivered as he looked down at them. Do you know that several people lost their lives and are in the bridge's cements? The words of his grandfather whispered. The cables of the bridges snapped and the cars drove off the edge into a hole beneath. He watched as people went down into the hole, their faces contorting with an indescribable terror. Halfway across the bridge, a loud rumble. He was not afraid of heights. He was afraid of this situation. A bridge collapsing. He always wanted to take the tunnel. It felt more secure than a rusty green bridge. He turned around and the bridge collapsing behind him. He was almost at the other end when he saw workers with wires. The wire of their power tools hung around their necks, and the rails of the bridge dangled. The bridge behind him collapsing deep into the cavern below. The bridge collapsed beneath him as he couldn't outrun it. He slides down on his back. It tears the flesh off his spine and burns his muscles. He lies at the bottom, centimeters from the base of the hole. He turned around and stared into the abyss. Nothing. The bridge was gone as if it never existed. He slowly rose, his black back stung as the fresh water cleaned the rubble from his wound. He walked 3 more clicks, blind. No light pierced the water. It felt as if the light was being sucked away from the sea. He walked into a canyon. The wall squeezed him. His eyes felt as if they were going to burst out of their sockets. He was not unfamiliar with claustrophobic environments. In fact, this was normal and relaxing to him. It was much like a hug, except from 2 stone golems. Near the end, he could see the light in the form of a cylinder, much like that projected from a flashlight, but it was almost blinding at the end. Before him, he saw something that horrified him. He had felt the pressure of the water. His head felt as all the pressure of the water on Earth had been placed on him. His frame was crushed by the gravity of the situation. His mind felt as if it was being sucked out of his head. It was not of a comprehensible size. The more he looked at it, the larger it grew exponentially. 10 clicks, 20 clicks, 40 clicks. Its radius grew so large that before he could react to the pit consumed him, he fell down through it. The dark repressed emotions in his mind grew wild. They fed off the darkness of the pit, getting more violent. They amalgamated into the amalgamations of the emotions were almost incomprehensible. No light could be seen, except that of which was condensed to the point of being a laser in the middle. The pit sucked the vitality from his body, like marrow from the bone. His mind was separated and turned into its most pure state. His lungs emptied as he screamed and shouted. The red sea glass fell out of his pocket. It fell like blood from his body. A glimmer of hope lost to the abyss.